David, I want to start with you, and I have a really straightforward question. I don't know if the answer will be straightforward, but we'll see. What is it like to cover Donald Trump? You covered his campaign first, now you're covering the Trump organization.
My experience has been, there's two things about it that sort of define it and make it different than covering other people. One is that they don't talk to me. The Trump organization talks to some people, the Trump campaign talks to some people. They've never talked to me. Trump and I spoke last in May of 2016, which had caught him basically, his campaign had basically said that he'd given away $1 million to veterans charities when he really hadn't. And I'd figured out that he really hadn't, made him give the $1 million. After that, he hasn't ever called me back. His campaign has occasionally called me, but generally they don't. Generally they don't even say no comment, they just don't respond. So the challenge for that, because of that, the challenge becomes trying to find out things about the campaign, about Trump's charitable giving, and now about the Trump organization from other people, from other sources. I think that Trump has always seen his relationship with the media in a way that he is the only arbiter of facts about himself. You want to know what I did or what I have or how much money I have or what I've done, I'm the only person who can tell you. And so if I don't want to tell you, you can't write a story. So for me, it's meant a lot of work to try to find other sources of information about Trump where you don't need his participation to write about him.
Eric, I'm going to move on for a second. I want to ask you about how you understand the role of journalism in covering the Trump administration, and how you understand specifically ProPublica's role in covering the Trump administration.
Sure. So I think that journalists have an enormous challenge in covering Trump. Mm-hmm. One of my colleagues described the Trump administration as, this is to use a techie term, and I'll describe it, a DDoS attack. A DDoS attack is, everybody who understands a DDoS attack is a denial of service. When you throw so much information and data and messages at a place that it can't handle it, and it shuts down, right? The sort of fundamental challenge of the Trump administration is that there is so much noise and so many things going on. And I think some of that stuff is noise in that it's not particularly important, but a lot of it is noise that is important. It is important what the president says. It carries meaning, it carries weight. It is also quite important what the president and the administration does. And an administration, right, the US government is a massive operation. There are agencies, dozens of agencies and offices within them, and there are many things happening within it. And so one of the things, we had a discussion, I'm sure like every newsroom in America, in the weeks after the election, and says like, what do we do now? And one of the fundamental answers for us, and I think we are very lucky at ProPublica in the position that we're in, is that we can respond to the noise with focus, right? We don't have to, for those who aren't familiar with us, we're an investigative newsroom, nonprofit. We are in the lucky position, we don't have to cover the news of the day. What we can do is dig in to things that we think are the most important, whether they're in the news right now or not. And so we can stay focused in the face of news. And I think that is is a great advantage that we have, and it also, the truth is, presents some challenges. I wrote about this at one point, and David and I have talked about it, which is, news organizations like ProPublica, investigations, the typical investigation you think is a thing that takes many, many months, and you say an investigation of 18 months has found X. We don't have 18 months, right? Stuff is changing too quickly that you can begin to look at something and, it turns out the position yesterday is not the position today. So what are you supposed to do about that? I mean, you can look at that from the wall to DACA to NAFTA and go on and on and on. So it requires, all of that put together, requires an enormous amount of discernment and thought about where we put our finite resources ultimately.
An issue that the three of us all talked about actually before we came here today, was in the face of all this noise. Every day there's some revelation about the kind of palace intrigue going on in the White House, or Trump tweets something out about Rocket Man and everybody's hair, lights on fire, and we think, oh my God, how do we make sense of this? And so there's a ton of reporting on Trump himself. And there was actually a really interesting study performed by the Pew Foundation, which showed that during the first 8 months of Trump's presidency, something like 70% of the coverage of Trump was focused on his character and personality and things like that. 26% was focused on policy. This is different from how it was during the Obama years, actually during the Clinton years, and during even the George W. Bush years. And so I guess my question is, while we really do have to cover a lot of the stuff Trump says, if he says something racist about NFL players, that's a conversation we need to have. On the other hand, while he's saying something racist about NFL players, we have Puerto Rico unfolding, we have North Korea. So, in your mind, are we, as the media in general, and is the media doing a decent enough job of not being distracted by Trump, or sort of taking into account the wild things he says, while not missing what's happening, for instance, at HUD under Ben Carson? So I want to turn that to you, Eric, again, and then David, I'd love you to jump in.
Sure, I can give you my lengthy response to that.
I'd like a lengthy response.
No, that's my response. No.
Okay.
It's a very, very challenging thing. Again, we at ProPublica are in this very lucky position, and so that we don't have the certain, quite understandable constraints that other news organizations have. And again, one can argue, I think rightly, that how Trump comports himself is important, how his office works is important, but there are these vast apparatuses of power across the administration. I mean, you can go from agency to agency and think about how profound and important its policy changes can be, whether it's, worker safety, whether it's your retirement account and how that works. And, you can go to all sorts of esoteric stuff that you never even really think about. And one of the fundamental, truths is that if you look at, I've sort of called this reporter density, right? So there is high reporter density around, right now around Puerto Rico, a very important thing. There was very high reporter density around the NFL and the president's racist comments last weekend. If you look at the kind of matrix of where there are very few reporters and yet incredibly profound changes happening, that's ultimately where we want to be, and those are vast swaths of the federal government.
Sorry, just to push you, what are I'd like to hear what those swaths are.
I can't tell you all our stories.
I know, you don't have to tell me all your secrets.
Just
a few.
I have been, to tell you the truth, sort of obsessed with, I mentioned worker safety, right? Some of the stories that have come out, OSHA stopped publishing, this is a worker stats and incidents of worker deaths on its website, right? Do you think that's the only change happening at OSHA? My guess is no, right? You have incidents of take just another random example, the National Labor Relations Board, right, which has enormous influence upon workers' rights in the United States, right? Does anybody know what's happening there right now? I don't, right? And I'm probably more likely than most to know. You can go on, and there are some agencies that are sort of, get more prominence. EPA, right? Incredibly important. Lots of people know about it. But what about, just to take a random other example, the Interior Department. Interior Department owns an enormous portion of land in this country, right? It has, everything from regulates mining rights to land rights to environmental issues. How many reporters do you think are covering the Department of the Interior on a regular basis and focusing on accountability and digging? I think I know the answer to that. And it's very, very small. And in fact, it might look like this, right? Now, there are understandable commercial considerations, and and that is what it is. If the sort of question is, are we covering it adequately overall? I think the answer to that is no, for a lot of reasons. Not simply, right, economic. I mean, journalism has obviously atrophied.
Yeah.
The ability for accountability reporting. There are lots of challenges, but there is lots to dig up that is not being dug up.
Yeah. David, do you have thoughts on that issue as well?
To me, the interesting
Yeah.
thing about Trump is we sort of came in thinking that he was going to be this very strong figure. He said, only I can fix it. I'm going to change all these things. But actually what he's done is he's content to be the mouth of government, but often doesn't want to be the brain. And so
Yeah.
that means that he's devolved power. Like before, if you were going to cover Washington, how many zillions of people cover Washington? Before, you were covering about 5 people, right? You were covering the president, maybe the chief of staff, the Senate majority leader, the Speaker of the House, maybe 2 other people in Congress. Those were the presidency had unified so much power that you could cover the agriculture secretary, but you might as well just cover the White House because the White House is going to tell the agriculture secretary what to do. Trump has devolved so much power because he's not interested in the details of governing or because he changes policies constantly. He's devolved power to where not only all the cabinet secretaries matter, they really do. They can set, if you have somebody who's a very aggressive deregulator like Scott Pruitt at EPA versus somebody who's less active, it really matters who's in the cabinet secretary positions. But also, when have we ever cared so much about Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins and John McCain? The individual personalities and needs of all these members of Congress, particularly senators, really matter. I think it's a great time to be covering Washington because there's so many more people who are involved in decision making just because Trump is unwilling to do it or uninterested in doing it. And that really has surprised me. So as Trump has continued to talk, I think it's, as Eric said, it's important to talk, to note what he says, but so little of the time is what he says a predictor of what will happen that I think we're adjusting to that world.
That's actually, I hadn't thought of it that way, and that is completely fascinating to me and makes eminent sense. So I want to follow up with a little bit more about the work that you've done, which is, you did some incredibly consequential stories last year in particular, and I know you're working on more now. You just, helped unearth the tape. You uncovered the lies behind Trump's so-called charity work, and Trump still got elected. And so, I think when a lot of us get into journalism, we have this belief that the stories we write, maybe if we're really lucky, will change something, will uncover something of consequence. And so, and not just you, but other reporters have done fantastic work, even as journalism, the resources in journalism have contracted a lot. We've seen some of the best reporting we've seen in a long time. Trump is still in power. So I guess, one kind of maybe reductive question I have is the good journalism we're seeing making a difference?
Okay, can I tell you a brief story at the beginning of this?
Yeah.
Okay, so after Access Hollywood came out, a week later, it seemed like the whole election had changed. Trump was, losing support from all these Republicans. It seemed like, obviously the point of my reporting was not to take Donald Trump out or to make him lose, but it seemed that right after Access Hollywood, things had really changed in the election because of a story that I did. And I was interviewed by, not often interviewed by other reporters, but I was interviewed by a German reporter who had this he was weird in a lot of ways. It was a strange interview, and he was like, "What sort of housework do you do at home?" And I was like, I fold the clothes, and he was like, "Why do you like that? What is it about that attracts you?" Anyway, at the end of the interview, we talked about what a consequential story Access Hollywood had been, and he was like, it was such a big deal, and he was like, "Do you think this was the peak of your life?" So, I hope it wasn't. I mean, at the time I was like, fine, that's good. Yeah, I don't mind. But so we don't do this to change elections. You can't go into political reporting thinking that that's the point of it, is to change the outcome of the election. I think I felt like between Access Hollywood and the charity reporting, we gave people a real sense of who Donald Trump was. If you read the stories that I wrote, and I tried to make sure as many people read them as possible, you knew who this guy was. And so all I can do is give you that information. Who you vote for, that's not my control. And so now, I think our job is not to like take Donald Trump out, get him out of power. It's to show people what's really going on. Whether you love him or hate him, you need to know what's actually happening. And he himself is such a poor source of information about what's actually happening in his administration that we're needed so much more to actually decode what's happening. I think we've never been, because Washington, like the divide between, there's always a divide between the words of Washington and the actions, but it's so much greater than it's ever been that we're so much more important. And the facade between who he says he is and who he really is so great that he has a large role to play. So, I try not to think about my job as in terms of political outcomes, but in terms of what how close can I get to the truth about this man, his government. I think we're doing a really good job at that. I think, what you said about journalism, about Washington really standing out, I think some of the reporting we've seen from ProPublica and a number of other places has been extraordinary this year, and there hasn't been this kind of need for journalism about Washington in a long time. I think in many ways, we're rising to it.
David, do you have any thoughts on that question of, if not, that's fine.
No.
I think during our initial conversation, you said some interesting stuff. I can
say some
I
interesting
can nudge
stuff.
you if you need nudging.
I think that, I actually think there's a lot of evidence that journalism is still having a very clear effect. And, the truth is a lot of the facts that, journalism organizations, the Washington Post, you name it, have put out have not reflected well on the administration. The fact that the administration, that the president has the lowest approval rating in modern history, I think the fact that we are telling the truth about what's happening is probably a component of that. You just had, you also have an administration that has yet to have any major legislative victory, right? Now, again, as David said, and I think it's right, you don't sort of go in saying we're going to stop them from having legislative victories, and how do we do that? That's just, right, that's just a different universe. But, it is the, yes, a president was elected about whom there were many public negative facts had been dug up, right? He also lost the popular vote by X million, and he, there are a million reasons for the election and so forth, but I simply don't think it's not such a binary thing, right? And I mean, you look to last week's news. Is it last week now? So Tom Price is no longer Secretary of Health, right, and Human Services. He's now out of a job. He's out of a job because of journalism, right? And so the notion that facts don't matter or uncovering facts, don't resonate anymore, it's simply not true.
So I want to focus for a moment on the election and the results that took so many of us by surprise. And David, I have a question, which is, when you were covering Trump and it was so intense during the election, did you do the dishes? Okay. Just trying to be like the German reporter. Okay, no, here's the real question. You've written about your surprise at Trump's victory. And in fact, before the election, I think you volunteered to write the piece for the Washington Post, the sort of, if Trump wins, you were going to write the piece saying, okay, Trump won, and here's the deal. And you've written that it seemed almost frivolous taking that assignment. You said, based on the polling data, it felt fantastical and pointless to write this article, like designing a Super Bowl ring for the Cleveland Browns, which is a great line. And so I guess the question is, I think clearly you weren't alone. My publication, I don't know if I should say this, but we only had a Hillary Clinton cover. And so, we had to tear it up. And so I guess the question is, why do you think so many news outlets got it wrong? Was it the polls, as you suggested in that piece? Was it that we're all such out-of-touch, Chardonnay-sipping coastal elites that we couldn't possibly know the will of the people? What happened?
Eric may have a different view than me, but this was why okay, so look back before Nate Silver. If you go back to like the 2004 election, before Nate Silver was a big deal, there was an assumption among political reporters that basically nobody knew who was winning. And the way political coverage was done was like whatever reporter was with the candidate would write about sort of intangible things like momentum, narrative, endorsements, but nobody really knew. And so you had to wait till the election came to really know who was winning. Maybe you had a sense, but it was never that certain. Well, then Nate Silver comes along and he can say, well, look, every day I can give you a scorecard. I'm not sure this is what he meant to do, but this is the way people took it, right? Barack Obama has a 90% chance of winning today. Then the candidates do some things. The next day, Barack Obama has a 91% chance of winning. You can say, okay, Obama won the day. He was better off. And you felt like going into the election, you knew who was going to win. This time around, Nate Silver actually tried to warn people. His was like, I think 60-something percent or 70% for Hillary on the day of, but other people said 99% for Hillary. The upshot for the New York Times was 80-something for Hillary. We as political journalists got into journalism because we don't like math and don't want to ever do it. And so we never, at least, I'll speak for myself, never understood really what went into those things because they've been, the sample size of them being right was small, but they've been right with both Obama elections. So we thought, okay, well, we know who's going to win. Nate Silver and these other people told us who's going to win. Hillary's going to win. And I think that whole process, never really understanding, okay, some of the state polls that went into them were close and they were not very good. And there was a lot of warning signs that most of us just didn't get because we were looking at the big percentages. And I think that affected a lot of the coverage before the election, certainly, that Trump did all these things, but there was a sense that we were covering one candidate and one future president. Clinton being the future president, she was the one who was vetted like somebody who would actually take office. Trump was vetted also. We wrote a lot of stories about him, but I don't think there was never a sense, really a widespread sense that he could actually win. In fact, on the night of the election, the stories that we had budgeted, I had pre-written a story saying Trump was going to win, right. But I'd done that for Romney in 2012 and other people. But we had stories budgeted sort of, one of them was slugged like repudiate. The story was called repudiate. Like we were preparing for not just Trump to lose, but for Trump and his agenda to be wiped off the map, to Republicans to go down in flames and have to begin rebuilding. So we missed it, I think, in part because it never seemed, there was never, or maybe there was like one day where Trump was actually favored to win in Nate Silver, and I think there was a sense that it just was never, it was a sure thing. No matter what was going on, no matter how many Trump signs you saw in Western Pennsylvania, the numbers said she was going to win. The numbers had been right before, so we trusted them.
You looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah, no, I it's something I've thought a lot about, and I basically agree with everything David said, but I'd add, it's that there was a sort of more profound issue, I think, going on for us. And after the election, we had a podcast, and I invited onto a podcast a number of journalists to sort of talk about how do we approach the administration, the incoming administration at the time, how do we understand it, how do we understand the win. And one of the people that I spoke with is a fabulous Russian-American journalist named Masha Gessen. And Masha Gessen has spent the last decade plus covering the rise of authoritarianism and Putin. And she had written about Trump in the context of demagogues and in the context of strongmen. And she said a number of things that, and this is a week, maybe two after the election, that have really stuck with me since, and I've found to be very prescient. And one of the things she said is, when you react to something and say, that can't happen, right? That's just not imaginable. That should be a cue to you to stop yourself and to think, yeah, it can, right? Sure, it can. And I think, I think there were a lot of empirical things going on in the election, right? The Comey letter and, on and on. But I think, for myself, I thought, so a guy who can't seem to read from a teleprompter, a guy who's bragged about sexually assaulting women ultimately, a guy who's, race baited in such a, obvious and profound way. Right, a guy who has had to pay tens of millions of dollars in fines for and settlements, around Trump University, which isn't a university, right? And on and on, and I just thought it's just not possible, to be honest, right? And I think that's not so much about Chardonnay. And but is a kind of deeper psychological and human thing, right? And and that's just the God's honest truth. And I think lots of organizations found themselves, us included, about saying like, we hadn't planned for that, right? I mean, as a journalism organization, it doesn't matter what what individuals' political allegiances are, or right, as a matter of self-interest, right? We should be thinking critically about, well, clearly we have to plan for X possibility and Y possibility, right? We didn't really, and we're not the only place, again and again, and I think that speaks to something very deep.
So. A lot of organizations did go through this soul searching. And I think we've seen a number of them. I mean, a number of newspapers have been absolutely fantastic, but we've also seen some of these newspapers and some of the TV networks decide that they must have been out of touch with the American people, so it's essential to bring in these conservative voices. And so we have Bret Stephens, kind of a climate denialist on the editorial page or the op-ed page of the New York Times as a columnist. We have Megyn Kelly and Greta Van Susteren and Hugh Hewitt at NBC and MSNBC. Maybe this is too much of a softball, but what do you make of that reaction?
David.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, is there any merit to it? Am I just being cynical here?
I mean, I don't know. Like for Bret Stephens of the New York Times, obviously climate change is real and denying it is incorrect. For them, if they want to add an extra voice to their pages, even somebody I think is wrong about some things, I don't get that. I'm not that worried about it. The thing that I think has been interesting about journalism, like how we've reacted to the Trump phenomenon that we clearly didn't understand, is this weird habit that I think people are sort of getting out of now, of making it so that the only arbiter of Trump's popularity are the people that love Trump, right? Like think when Obama was at his lowest ebb politically, think about like 2010, the Tea Party wave is coming on, about his party's about to get massacred in the midterms. Nobody was going to like Brooklyn Heights and saying like, in Brooklyn Heights, in liberal Brooklyn Heights, people still like Obama. Like we assumed that was true, right? But this is like a lot of us live on the East Coast. Like that's not surprising. The people who were liberals still like Obama. But the idea that you would go to a place where often a gathering of people who define themselves as people who love Trump and say, "Hey, do you love Trump?" Here under the sign that says "I love Trump," and if they say yes, to say, "Well, Trump hasn't lost his base." I think that we've set this in trying to understand why people voted for Trump. We've ended up setting a bar for him that is so low for success. Like, can he please people who have tied their identities to him? And then the corollary to that is like, we've lost so much confidence in our own ability to judge success or failure as a politician. Then it's like he read a speech from a teleprompter, which is a normal occurrence for every other president. And they're like, well, that was amazing. We became president today. I think that's a mistake. I think that, it's covering Trump and understanding his base. You should not separate yourself from what you should always do with presidents, which is to judge their effectiveness, right? You can't let their fans be the only arbiters of their success. You have to be able to stand back and say, are they effective? Are they doing what they said they would do? And I think people have gotten away from that, but there was a time when like every day some news outlet would say, in X town in Pennsylvania or West Virginia, they still love Trump no matter what he did. Well, of course they do. That's just the way politics works.
So, I think among the interesting work that the two of you do is actually a type of engaged journalism that does try to reach out to people and get their input and tries not to remain in kind of whatever the equivalent of the ivory tower of journalism is. And so I'm wondering first, David, if you can talk a little bit about the interesting methodology you used on the philanthropy reporting that you did to kind of reach out to people and pull them into your reporting, and that you're still using now, which I think is actually a more interesting way of kind of countering the possible detachment that we journalists have from, whatever the real world is.
So basically, my approach was that there's people that I'm writing for, like the way that we used to write for people was like, I'm going to do some reporting over here by myself, and then when I have a story, I'm going to write it, and then I'll be silent again, and then after some indeterminate period of time, it could be a day, it could be a month, I'll write another story, and then if you want to pay attention to me, you'd have to just go to the Washington Post every day and check to see if I'm writing something there, and if that made sense in a day when the paper was the only, there were only stories in the paper. That was the only method we had to communicate with readers. And also when there wasn't that much else going on. But now every day there's some like tornado of crazy news that people can be caught up in. I mean, people think of this, the high point of this might have been the brief Scaramucci era, where like every day something completely insane would happen 3 times a day. So I want to be conscious of the fact that my readers, if I think it's important that readers are following what I'm doing, I have to give them something every day. I have to make sure there's a communication with them. So like there's stories that I write, but there's also times that I'm just communicating with you about what I'm interested in, what I'm trying to figure out. So last year I did this a lot with the charitable giving, like trying to let people know, okay, here's what I'm doing to try to find evidence that Trump actually gave the money he said he gave. I'm doing this both so you'll remember me, you'll follow my work even when I don't have a story, but also so people can talk back. And I wasn't even really intending for the talking back to happen at the beginning, but it happened. People started getting back to me with suggestions about who I should call, or when I had particular things I was looking for, helping me find them. The great example, there's a couple of great examples where I just didn't even know that I was asking for help. I sort of just blundered into this ability. So the best example of this to me was last year, we're looking back at old records from the Donald J. Trump Foundation, this charity he set up in the 80s. In 1989, the Trump Foundation gives a $7 grant to the Boy Scouts. Okay, only $7. It was the smallest donation in the history of the Trump Foundation. Like, all right, that's it. As a reporter, you go, well, there's got to be something weird story there. It's got to be something great. But Trump wouldn't talk to me, and the Boy Scouts wouldn't talk to me, and it was 20-something years ago. And I thought, okay, well, this is just unknowable. Like, this has disappeared into the mists of history. I'll never find the answer to this. So I just tweeted it out one day as I was going home for the day, like, I'll never know the answer to this, but isn't this weird? Wouldn't you love to know the answer to this question? What was this money for? And as I'm like taking an Uber home, I'm watching on my phone as people, like, it was like watching like a supercomputer in action, watching in like in a spy movie where, they're tracing where the hacker is, and, you can see all the pieces coming together at once. So people, first of all, think it might be popcorn, right? Because Boy Scouts, those of you who've been Boy Scouts, they sell terrible, crappy popcorn. It's stale, it was popped like 3 years ago. That's their answer to the Girl Scouts cookies. So people are like, well, maybe it was popcorn. Maybe Donald Trump bought a tin of popcorn from the Boy Scouts in 1989. So Trails End Popcorn, who makes the terrible popcorn, they're on Twitter tweeting about God knows what, tweeting about popcorn, I guess. We just popped our newest batch, check it out in 2021. They are on Twitter, and so they tweet at, people start tweeting at Trails End Popcorn, how much did a tin of popcorn cost in 1989? And they get back to us, well, no, it cost $5. Okay, well, that's not it. Throw that aside. Some other person finds on Google a scanned newspaper from the 80s, like from 1989, a newspaper from upstate New York, where they'd scan not just the articles, but they'd scan the ads too, so you could search the ads. And they found an ad from the Boy Scouts saying, sign up your son for the Boy Scouts this fall 1989. Registration is just $7 for the year. So it was registration for the Boy Scouts. Don Jr. turned 11 that year, and Donald Trump had just written a book about how rich he was, a rich book saying that he had more money than he knew what to do with. He used the charity's money to pay for his son's Boy Scout registration. But that would have been impossible. I mean, there's so many things I ran into last year and this year where I know what I want, but I don't even know what the first step is to get it. Like I can make a million phone calls or emails, but I don't even know what the first step is. And when I've asked people for help, I've been amazed that people have the context to know, okay, here's the first step. You couldn't find it, but I know what it is. I'm still finding that this year. It's really been incredible to try to harness that.
And Eric, those were great stories, by the way. And I loved reading about them, but hearing them is actually even more thrilling. Eric, you also are kind of engaged in a similar effort, and I'd love to hear about that.
I have no popcorn stories.
It's okay. You
can, you know.
In the spirit of Trump, just make it up.
Right. Exactly. There's tremendous popcorn. You know, we have the Trump administration, here's the shocking thing, is incredibly opaque. And the Trump administration did this sort of absurd thing a number of months ago where, so every administration, you know, there are actually hundreds of people who work at the White House, and over a certain threshold in terms of your salary, you have to financial disclosures. You have to file what assets you have and how you got them and so forth, right? To avoid enriching yourself via public, via working for the government, for the people. And so when Obama had done that, what they would do is they take all of the disclosures and they put them online, right? So the Trump administration had a somewhat different approach to it. Okay, you ready? You ready for the different approach? It's fun. They said, and this is true, right? They put out a press release at about 5 p.m. on a Friday, because that's actually the best time for transparency. And they put out a press release and they said, we are taking this the next step. We are, all of the financial disclosures, you can request any staffer's financial disclosure. You just have to send us their name. You thought, okay, so you guys aren't putting it on the site, so we have to know their name? And the answer to that was yes. But there's another trick, right? There's more. They won't say who works at the White House. So you're like, well, I know that at the time. Now I'm trying to think of somebody who still works at the White House who worked there 3 months ago. There's nobody. Right, there was Sean Spicer. I know Sean Spicer, right? Steve, he's still around, yeah. Right? So I know, a handful of people. But again, there are hundreds. So, and they're not going to tell us who. So we had to play what I called a game of transparency battleship. You'd say, John Smith, and they'd say no, and you'd say Joe Smith, and say yes, and then they'd say, we'll send you their form in a few hours, and you're like, So this happened on a Friday, and we thought, well, this is a real pain in the ass, frankly, right? We want to look through these things. There are inevitably stories. And one of my colleagues had the idea of, why don't we call the AP and our friends at other publications and create a Google spreadsheet so that we can so that everybody who knows a name, we can collect it all, and then as an extra, I think it's technically called FU, we put them all once we got them, we put them, by which I mean fabulous transparency, we put them all in a Google Drive for anybody to read, right? So we got all of these, and it was, again, hundreds of forms about financial disclosures, and these are not, these are government disclosure forms, right? They're not necessarily the easiest to read. You have lots of times when people will say, X was bought by, ABC LLC. And you're like, well, I don't know what ABC LLC is, right? So there were all these things, and so we invited readers. We said, help us understand this stuff. And somebody emailed us, actually about the president himself had to file a financial disclosure. Somebody emailed us and said, it's funny, the president said he sold 2 condos that were on Central Park South. We're all New Yorkers. Central Park South is not cheap real estate. He sold them for $300,000. And it's weird. He sold them to this random LLC, an LLC, limited liability corporation. It's a shell corporation. You don't know who that is. But this was an incredibly intrepid reader who said, yeah, and I dug around and I did some Googling and looking through property records for this LLC. And I'll be damned, that LLC is Don Jr. Right?
Wow.
and it turned out that what Trump was doing was selling his condos to his son at a discount, which is a very Menschy thing to do, a very nice thing to do, and I got no issue with it. But when you are selling something at a discount, essentially giving it in some portion to, in this case, your beloved son, well, that's a gift. And there are federal taxes that have to be paid on gifts. So we thought, well, gee, did he pay a gift tax, right? And the answer to that was no. Now, I should point out, as a side note, by the way, it turns out, and this is, Michael Kinsley said at one point, a longtime journalist said, the real scandal isn't what's illegal, it's what's legal, right? I say that not in any way connected to the following facts that I'm about to tell you, which is that, in fact, he wasn't breaking the law because he owned the building, and as the owner of the building, he could actually essentially set the fair market value, right? So he could say, yeah, I sold them a $300,000 condo because it was worth $300,000. How do you get to do that? I own the effing building, right? And QED America.
I just want to follow up and say, I think in something you wrote, you described this type of journalism or the role of the journalist in this capacity as a kind of community organizer. Journalist as community organizer, that is not traditionally how we thought of ourselves. Even sort of the folks like me who are in the unabashedly lefty trenches, we don't think of ourselves as community organizers or sort of information organizers or participants in a participatory system of fact gathering, and that's actually quite revelatory for me.
So we've done this in other ways. I mean, what we're describing to you is, an intrepid reader who's very interested, and this actually really gets to the kind of reaching outside our bubble is what we have done a lot of and had a lot of success doing is saying, we've actually done this. This is not a Trump topic, but I think I'm allowed to say it anyway. Okay.
Permission.
Right. So we've done this. Actually, the U.S. has the highest maternal mortality rate of any industrialized nation by a long shot, right? By a number of times X. And we said we want to understand, and by the way, not coincidentally, the U.S. doesn't track it, right? It's incredibly difficult to understand who is dying from what. So we said, well, we want to figure out not just what's going on, but to hear the stories. So we created with experts ultimately a questionnaire. And we said, we want to hear from people who's either had a family member die, mother die, or somebody themselves had serious complications. There are 60 to 70,000 mothers who have serious complications again every year. That's an enormously higher rate than other industrialized nations. We said, we want to hear your story. And we've heard now from 4,000 people and have been able to tell some, profound, important stories as a result. And, that is something, that is a technique that is very powerful and that also reaches across constituencies, right? So we did this about Vietnam veterans who had been poisoned by Agent Orange and were not getting compensation, right? I'd probably say that your typical Vietnam veteran is probably not a reader of ProPublica. Although I'd be happy if many were. And we heard from 7,000 of them. And, that is not just fueling our reporting, but frankly helping to galvanize those people themselves to organize themselves, yes, and to have their voices heard. And, we do it in a journalistic capacity, but absolutely. And in turn, that opens us up to new audiences and new perspectives.
So I want to open this conversation up to the audience in one moment. I want to sort of finish our part of the conversation by looping back.
Very good segue, by the way.
Thank you. I try. I began my time here on stage by joking about Trump's threats to journalists about his disparagement. But it's actually pretty serious. He has obviously threatened journalists and sort of told Comey, I guess, allegedly, that he thought journalists who publish the works of leakers should be jailed. He's retweeted images of the Trump train kind of smashing into somebody with a CNN logo on its head. And he obviously calls the work that a lot of really respectable, hardworking journalists do. He describes it as fake news. So I guess my final question for you guys is, has this had an effect on the work you do? Do you feel the chill? Do some of his statements or Jeff Sessions' statements on wanting to crack down on leakers and the journalists who publish their work, does that affect what you do?
I mean, it doesn't affect what I do particularly, because I do a lot of calling golf courses. But no, certainly these are worrisome statements. These are worrisome precedents. I take some solace in the fact that they have not really followed through that much on those statements, and the fact that nobody loves the news media more than Donald Trump. Nobody consumes more of the news media's products than Donald Trump does. But I feel like the danger for us, right? We have to think about what can we control. And to me, the danger for us is to get in a situation where we act like we're in a war with him, or we absorb the idea of, that we are the opposition party, as Bannon called us, that we're we're at war with Donald Trump. I think so much of Trump's strength is drawn by the fact that he makes people in the media outraged, that he sort of can gin up media outrage with a tweet, with a statement. I think our responsibility to readers is to report on what matters, and not to be people who play into the sort of us versus them narrative. If they turn to us, there's somebody who loves Donald Trump and they turn to us, that they find that we are not, we're just reporting what's going on. We're judging Donald Trump by his actions and not trying to convince you that Donald Trump is an outrageous person or shouldn't be president. That we sort of like hold on to the credibility and the fairness that make us who we are, and that we're not taunted out of that by Trump.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or
No, I mean,
any concluding thoughts?
I would say has the Trump administration and the vituperative language that they've used against journalists had any chilling effect on us? No, not even no.
Yeah.
Right. And our job is to tell the truth, and the truth is a lot harder to come by nowadays. Frequently, right? It is always hard to come by, but I think particularly so now. And that is, among other emotions, I think, ultimately energizing for us.
Well said.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, thank you both so much for all your wise answers. And now we'd love to turn it over to you for questions. I think Bo over there has the microphone, and he's going to be ferreting out folks in the audience, and then you can ask away.
All right, so just wait for just a moment while the microphone gets to you as I pick people up.
Thank you. We were told earlier this year that the White House needed renovations because some of its systems had become worn out or obsolete. Has anybody looked, and that's the last I've heard of it, have these renovations been completed? Has anybody dug into it to see whether any of the tax money spent on them wound its way into the Trump pockets, and whether the original plans were changed to be more elaborate and more expensive at Trump's behest? And the other question is, the $1 million that he recently pledged in hurricane relief to Florida or Texas, I guess, has he actually coughed that up? Thank you.
I'll take the second part first, just because I've inquired about that. So he pledged to give money to Hurricane Harvey relief from Texas, and he pledged $1 million to 12 different charities. I've called all of them. About half the charities don't release their donors, and so they haven't said. The other half said that he did, in fact, give them a personal check. So that part, at least as far as I can confirm, I've confirmed that he gave the money. The second part about the renovations, do you know much about that?
Oh, that's a good. You should.
That's
be
a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I know I remember they renovated the Oval Office while he was at Bedminster, but I don't know much more about it than that. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay. So many of presumably the overwhelming majority of people in this room are in fact consumers of what 45 considers fake news, be it the Washington Post, New York Times, National Public Radio, ProPublica, and look upon it as serious reporting, and it's really, really important. But Trump, being the brilliant demagogue that he is still, he did not create the bifurcation in American society of distrust and alienation. People were, maybe the phrase fake news and the threats were not happening before he took office, but that reality that a chunk of America is incredibly alienated from what we would consider to be serious news, that's been going on before. He's only taking advantage of it and exacerbating it. And do you have thought, I mean, it's very distressing to me, it's probably to you, and,
Yes.
and something that I worry about for the future of this nation. I mean, that saying, I mean, it's an old cliche about everyone has their, you have your own opinions, but not your own facts.
I mean, I am worried about that, and I think we can only reach people. We have to be. To me, the most important thing is we have to be conscious of the fact that people are. We hope people will come to us. People that will get out of that bubble where they think the mainstream media is fake and will come to us one time, right? And so, what impression do we give them? What do we show them? How do we help them both understand what's going on? How do we sort of not drive them away with bias or sort of frivolous coverage? How do we, when people want to take that first step toward trusting the news media, I think we have to be really conscious of those customers and reach them and keep a hold of them. When we're gaining readers, as I know y'all are too, so I hope that's a good sign that people are coming out of that bubble. But one example of how that, like, the way Trump sort of managed to shape the narrative in a way that I think people fall into, right? You've all seen the last few days the San Juan mayor in Puerto Rico talking about how terrible things are. And so Trump, she says things are bad. Trump says you're ungrateful and terrible, I don't like you. And then the media writes about it as a feud with the San Juan mayor, right? When she's like just telling you what's going on in her destroyed city. I think we have to be careful of that, not framing things in Trump's terms. But at the same time, being mindful of the fact that so many of it, we want readers to come in from the cold. We want to be sure that we're like a welcoming and easy place to get started.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would simply say, to me, the big distinction between media is evidence-based and non-evidence-based, right? And rigor and non-rigor. And I could care less about the political perspective because, there is a history of journalism that, people come from different perspectives and, all the better, right? But the fundamental question is, is it accurate? Is it fair? And frankly, I view our job as, I'm just going to be a broken record here, right? But we are about evidence, and we are about telling the truth. And telling the truth means not shading the truth, And I got no interest in softening the truth if the truth is hard.
Well, just to play off that, one thing that I feel like I'm trying to do more of is to be more obvious about the evidence that we have, right? What separates us from like Patriot News 24/7 or whatever crap people might read on Facebook. I think before we could speak as sort of the voice of God because we trusted that people thought, well, they're the Washington Post, they must know, and we were not so explicit about how we knew what we knew. And I've shown that social media helps with that. I'm trying to do it more with showing people the steps of my reporting, but also it means putting things in your stories about how exactly how many leakers in the West Wing you talk to, so people understand more, just from reading the copy. If they don't know anything about your reputation, how do they read in your copy that you're evidence-based versus not?
Yeah.
Hi. Just to give some context to the question before I ask it. I'm not Irish, so I wasn't very familiar with your media. The only media I get is the New York Times. And I was, but I I was really interested with Hurricane Irma in Puerto Rico, because what I noticed is that with Maria and Harvey, there was a really tremendous buildup before the hurricane by the media, and then there was a lot of coverage during and shortly after the hurricane, which really galvanized people to sort of do something, and also to some extent probably galvanized the government. With Irma onto Puerto Rico, there was no similar effort. There was just, I mean, I could see it in the New York Times. There was like compared with a photo of a guy in a boat, there was a small corner page of the New York Times. And I really think that, I think the media kind of dropped the ball in Puerto Rico. I mean, they're US citizens, and I was pretty disgusted with it, to be quite frank. And I don't know, I'm not sure if that's a Trump effect, because he was tweeting about the NFL, or it's just, I don't know if you can give me some other reason for that.
Well, yeah, I've been sort of tangentially involved in our hurricane coverage, so we were particularly badly prepared for it because there had been 2 hurricanes earlier, and so at least at the Post, we had deployed all of our people who'd been, were foreign correspondents, were national correspondents, the people that we send into difficult environments, and also the stringers we had in Texas. We'd activated all of them, and it had been 2 weeks of nonstop hurricane, difficult coverage, people living without water, waiting around in waist-deep water. And then, wow, another hurricane's going to hit Florida. So now we get some of the same people and some new people, and we send them to Florida, and that's really bad. We activate all the stringers there. So then you have all the people that you were sort of using as your utility players, sending from place to place. They're now exhausted because they've been in these really difficult environments. And then after that, after you've exhausted all of them, a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, which hits us. Maybe the Times is better about this, but for us, Puerto Rico had always been kind of a weird middle ground between the national desk and the foreign desk. It's the U.S. territory, obviously, but it's next to it. It's not on the mainland U.S., and so technically the national desk claims it, but the foreign desk people were closer, and the foreign desk
Someone's going to write a thesis about that.
Right, they would say, well, a hurricane hitting Cuba, well, foreign desk will send somebody there, but the Puerto Rico, that's America. So then, so it caught us between sort of stupid bureaucratic lines of the paper, and also caught us when all the people that we would sort of send as utility players were exhausted, and also required people to speak Spanish, which is a smaller number of people at the Post that we have deployed. So we were just not ready for it for a variety of reasons, obviously wrongly. I think that we missed, at the beginning at least, a really powerful story. I think we've staffed up. The Times has been ahead of us since Maria hit Puerto Rico, but for us it was a matter of factors that didn't have anything to do with politics and had a lot to do with the way we are organized and what we'd just been through.
I have one quick question, which is part of what I think is a problem in terms of reporters didn't report every statement that Barack Obama or George Bush or anyone else said. And instead, he tweets every morning. Every single news organization spends the entire morning talking about every one of its tweets. Is there a way not to do that? Is there a way? And you're tweeting and repeating things that
So I'm with you. I think that a lot of Trump's tweets don't need to be covered at all, or covered in the way they are. That said, we have a White House team that, you have to understand sort of what came before and the way we understood White House coverage, and so to understand the difficulty we've had shifting gears. Before, there was an idea that if the president was going to say something, it mattered because it was a guide to what the president was going to do, right? The president, if the president said something in his own voice, or if the White House said something in a leak, it was usually a sign that they were going to take action on that topic. It wouldn't just waste words, blow hot air. They were going to do something about it. So it was important to cover what the president said because it was a guide to what the president might actually do. And so at the very beginning, Trump gets elected. There's that period between November 8th and Inauguration Day where every time he tweeted, people would run around like crazy because it was like, he would say, I'm going to send the feds into Chicago. 3 million people voted illegally. All these things that were so off the wall, but we were still working on the assumption that what the president said, it was something the president was going to do. So it's taken us a long time to get to the idea that a lot of this is just him yelling at the television and not really an indication of action. And I think the fact that it may not seem like it, but I think we are covering his statements less. to the point that I think a lot of what he's been doing lately, especially in North Korea, is extremely dangerous. But he's trying to get the same. He's upping the dosage to get the same reaction, right? He wants people to cover his tweets, and so now he's like talking about nuclear war because it's the same thing. The only thing that gets him the same level of attention. But he's losing that ability, and I think it's good that we're not giving it to him. But it's been slow.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I read this interesting article about how company stocks were affected early on when Trump would tweet about them. So Trump had tweeted at one point about the F-35, which is, in fact, this crazy, overly expensive fighter by Boeing, I believe, and he was like, "Why, this thing is really expensive. I'm not doing this anymore," right? And, David is right. People thought, well, if the president says I'm not doing it anymore, there are probably going to be changes. That seems like a fair assumption, but it's not a correct assumption, it turns out. And company stock, so at the time, Boeing stock took a big hit, right? Well, nowadays, and I gotta admit, I'm not even sure I follow Trump anymore. But when he does write about a company now, it barely moves the stock. And I think we as a country are adjusting, and the media included. Now, that's a weird thing because the truth is, the president feeling strongly about something, like, it still can matter. And where is that line and so forth? And that's, just a very difficult thing to figure out. But I think that, we are indeed adjusting.
Sometimes as a thought experiment, I like to think about how we'll explain this moment in history to the children of the future.
You're making an assumption, by the way.
Well, I mean, I do like to explore it. Like, I mean, the question is will this be seen as a joke, a fluke, that crazy time we elected that crazy man, which certainly is not unprecedented in American history in any way, shape, or form, right. Or will it be a scary time? I don't know. So if you'll indulge me in the thought experiment, I just wanted you to picture the Brooklyn Historical Society at 2040, a panel very much like this. What will they say about this presidency and about journalism right now?
We'll all be wearing cool silver jumpsuits. That's how I imagine the future.
And jetpacks.
Yeah.
I mean, two things. One is, on the morning after the election, I said, I'm not going to be involved in the predictions game anymore. I'm out. So I'm out on that. But what I will tell you is how I've thought, and we've talked about covering journalism with being aware of being in the moment, and I'm going to sort of turn it around. Is one thing we've talked about, and I've used this is, again, as I was saying at the beginning, there are these, right, the most important thing you can decide as a journalist now is what you spend your time on, right? And for us investigative journalists, it lots of times can be very easy to say, well, I don't want to go where everybody else is. I want to cover X thing. And there's a lot of legitimacy in that, but there's another issue, which is you need to cover the most important things. And the analogy that I've used when we sort of are thinking about things in historical terms, and because I've done this as a thought exercise in the reverse, which is to say, imagine you were a journalist during the civil rights era and during Vietnam, right? And subsequently looking back years later, right? Would you have wanted to, and would you have been satisfied with your career if you had said, well, lots of people are covering civil rights. There's nothing more to, come on. That's a really well-covered thing, right? And I'm going to go write about, overspending in this random, tiny little agency. That would be very unsatisfying, right? It is our job to document and to, this is a highfalutin term, but to bear witness upon and to tell the truth. The massive and consequential changes that are happening, the human consequences that are happening as a result of changes and policies. And, I want to know 40 years out that we delivered on that and that we did what, one would hope, I think people would have done, and many did during the civil rights era or Vietnam.
I mean, I'll tell you what I hope people think about journalism. I don't want to predict about Trump, because if I say that Trump is a one-off, then Kanye West will be the next president. Well, we'll have only celebrity presidents from now on. I hope that for journalism, people look back and say that it was a moment of that forced humility on us, at least for Washington journalism. The rest of journalism, in the rest of the country has had humility forced on it by years of declining revenues. But in Washington journalism, we had humility forced upon us, and it made us better. It made us less arrogant. It made us less confident that we knew how the world was going to go, and it made us more attentive to facts instead of punditry. I hope that's what happens, but it's too early to know.
Next question.
To go back a little bit to the conversation about kind of personality-focused reporting, I guess. I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this question, so bear with me. I guess I'm kind of wondering if all three of you think that there may be kind of a trend towards black and white reporting, so looking at things as either good or evil, this is right, this is wrong, and kind of in the way that people are maybe more inclined to be watching a reality TV show because it's easy entertainment, and in the same way that maybe today people are looking for stories that are more straightforward, and they're not necessarily as willing to read the tough stories. I'm not necessarily saying that's a trend. I guess I just would be really curious to see whether that's something that has come up with conversations among you and your colleagues, or if that's something that maybe you hope it doesn't tend towards that, or you're trying to avoid, but I would really just love your thoughts on that.
I mean, the thing that, yes, I mean, I think that the thing that I worry the most about is the sort of the idea that the media will become political. I'm think about MSNBC and Fox. That there's two angles in every story, and then CNN in the middle often is just panels of people from both sides arguing about things. So there's the idea that there is an objective story to be told that's more complicated. I think that's lost often on TV news, and when TV news is such a huge driver of the rest of the news landscape. The thing that gives me hope, and there's a lot of things that give me hope, is John Oliver. I mean, he has a minuscule audience compared to the rest of us, but he and podcasts and things that Fox does, and there's a lot of appetite for something where you spend a much longer period of time in television land. So 20 minutes is an incredibly long period of time, and you learn the nuances of something, and you come out on the other side going, wow, I really understand that. That's something that journalism has always done, and the idea that people really glom onto that and enjoy it and want it as part of their experience, it's hard to do. It's much harder than having a panel of two uninformed people from both sides arguing, but I think it's that the fact that people want that, it really gives me hope that there's more of an appetite for it, and that we have to think of ourselves as aiming for that audience.
I think this is will be our last question. Oh, okay.
Okay, great.
Hi, I just wanted to pick up on something, Eric, you were just talking about, which was how do you focus? And I was wondering for each of you, all three of you, if you sit back at the end of the day, you've been drinking from the fire hose, everything's coming in, is there one story that you worry isn't being covered enough? Is there one thing that's out there that you say, I wish we had the resources to do this, I wish we could get more because this is bigger than people really think or understand?
Yeah. I mean, I would point to, in broad terms, the story that I mentioned before, which is what is really happening in all of the different mechanisms of government, right? Because that is a thing that, for various reasons, including the fact that there are very few reporters looking at it. I mean, we are one of the bigger and more well-resourced investigative newsrooms in the country, right? Well, we have about 30 reporters, right? Think about that, and we're not just doing Trump stories, right? So, we have some amount of resources completely and utterly inadequate to understand all of the different arms of government. And by the way, I don't mean this in sort of bureaucratic senses, right? The questions of what are the human consequences of these policies, right? That takes time. It takes going to places to find out, to tell compelling stories. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think there's a small fraction of those stories are likely to get told. And that's a shonda, to use a term.
My worry is that, I'll give you something that I'm trying to do and haven't gotten to yet, the effect that Trump's businesses have on his behavior, and not just the, one obvious consequence is that people are staying at the Trump hotel, paying a bunch of money, the Saudis paid for a bunch of rooms, the Malaysians paid for a bunch of rooms, what companies are using that hotel to benefit him, and then also I'm really interested in where he's losing money. He put a lot of his hotels and golf courses in places where the customers are largely wealthy liberal people from big coastal cities, and he's running a political operation that's dedicated to demonizing those people. If he starts losing business and golf courses start going out of business or needing big loans, or how much would Donald Trump owe a guy who stepped in and saved his golf course from bankruptcy? So that's something that I think I'm trying to watch with only minimal success so far. I think that's going to be a really big deal and might really predict his behavior in a way that other things might not.
I'm a worrier, so I worry about a lot of things. I'm going to echo Eric. I worry a lot about what's happening at all the many administrative agencies. When Steve Bannon was in the White House, he talked about wanting to destroy the administrative state. A lot of positions haven't been filled at these agencies. Some of those positions that have been filled by people who explicitly disagree with the intent, even the existence of the agency. We're talking about the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos. I already referenced HUD under Ben Carson. The Office of Mine Safety and Health Administration, things like that. I mean, our government has, it runs, we often don't even notice that it runs, that there's this whole apparatus making our lives possible. And what happens when that apparatus is intentionally starved or dismantled? And I think a lot of people aren't looking at it. I think it's because they don't think to, and I think also a lot of places do think to, but as Eric said, don't have the resources. That terrifies me. I also worry about what's happening in localities. The news media, the national news media has been shrinking, or the local media throughout the country has been shrinking. Storied old institutions in cities and states around the country have been going belly up. And so we're not really following what's happening at a local level. And so, in small towns and cities where there are where there's this crisis or that, another Flint happening, who knows, we're missing that. Finally, we really didn't even talk here tonight about the international scene. And, there is a massive cholera epidemic in Yemen right now. At least part of that has to do with the war that the United States backs the Saudis, and we don't even, most people don't even know that the United States is backing the Saudis in a war in Yemen, and there's this horrible health disaster unfolding, not to mention sort of the deaths of people by bombs and things like that. So I think there are vast parts of the world that are not being covered. That's in part because Trump is sucking up all the oxygen, but once again, it's because the media, our resources have shrunk over the last few decades, and so we don't have international bureaus like we used to. So that is an enormous source of concern for me as well. So on that cheery note, so thank you.